I never thought a simple business trip could become the darkest night of my life. My name is Jack Harper, and I was seated in row 12B of Meridian Air Flight 214, bound from Seattle to Dallas on a clear autumn afternoon. The hum of the engines was almost hypnotic. The cabin lights dimmed for a short nap, but I was too restless to sleep. Overhead, the flight attendants moved like clockwork. I watched them secure meal carts, adjust overhead bins, and exchange polite smiles. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As we climbed through 10,000 feet, I thumbed through photos on my phone, my fiancé's laughter frozen in time, my sister's graduation day, my father's last fishing trip. I was eager to get home and share the news of my promotion. Then, at cruising altitude, something jolted me awake. A vibration unlike anything I'd ever felt. It started low in my seat and traveled through the cabin. The lights flickered. Overhead, bins rattled. A split second later, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice, calm but urgent, cut through. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing an unexpected situation." One heartbeat later, there was a deafening snap, like steel tearing, and the plane lurched violently. Oxygen masks dropped, and screams filled the air. I clutched the armrests as the world outside went silent, the engines strangled to near inaudibility. It felt as if the very wires that held our metal bird together had been severed. Panic seized everyone around me. I could smell fear, the sweet tang of adrenaline mixed with the faint scent of hydraulic fluid. All I could think was, this is it. This is how it ends. But then, unbelievably, the plane stabilized, just enough for me to gasp. "We're still flying." The seatbelt light blinked off, and in that surreal calm, I pried open the safety brochure in my seatback and skimmed for anything about engine failure. Nothing mentioned what had just happened. A flight attendant hurried past, her hair streaming behind her. She locked eyes with me for a brief moment and mouthed, "Look out that window." I turned. Far below, the patchwork of orange and yellow farmland rolled into dusk, but at the wing's trailing edge, I saw it. A jagged tear in the metal housing, bits of frayed wire pulsing with sparks. The aileron cables, the ones that controlled our roll, had been cut clean. I swallowed and nearly choked on the sight. To see the guts of an airplane, wires dangling like severed nerves, was beyond comprehension. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. Minutes stretched like hours. The captain's voice returned, shaky this time. "We've lost primary roll control. We're diverting to the nearest airport. Please stay calm." My heart pounded against my ribs like a war drum. Every fiber of my being screamed that we would crash, that no one could survive this. Passengers clutched loved ones or stared blankly, their eyes reflecting the overhead lights. I tried to squeeze out a prayer, but my throat tightened. That's when I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. It was Maria, the young mother 2 seats ahead. She'd been comforting her 6-year-old daughter, whispering silly jokes to keep her calm. She turned and squeezed my arm, eyes bright but resolute. "We have to pick someone to stay awake," she hissed. "Who's going to tell people how it happened?" We shared a nod, an unspoken pact. We would tell the story. Through the haze of fear, adrenaline kicked in. I recognized training from years ago as a volunteer emergency responder. Check your surroundings, find the weak link, prepare for impact. I snapped my seatbelt tighter and scanned the cabin for the life vest under my seat. I watched the crew secure the cockpit door and activate emergency transponders. And as the miles ticked by, a strange clarity settled over me. Survive. When at last the runway lights of Yakima Regional came into view, the cabin descended into a hush. I braced against my seatback and braced again as the plane touched down with a bone-shaking thud. Screeching tires, a geyser of sparks from the wheel well, and then silence. We had stopped. The engines idled, the doors opened. One by one, stunned passengers filed out onto the tarmac, faces pale but alive. By the time rescue crews swarmed the plane, I realized Maria was gone. She had stayed behind to help others. I stumbled through the chaos, searching for her among stretchers and paramedics. But no one had seen her since we deplaned. In the weeks that followed, police revealed their shocking theory. Someone had deliberately cut the plane's control cables. Sabotage. And miraculously, I was the only one who survived. They questioned me, prodded for details I barely remembered. Headlines screamed about the mystery terrorist, the lone survivor, the cable cutter. But no one listened to what truly scared me, the idea that someone had wanted us to die, and only I had cheated death. When they arrested a disgruntled former technician from Meridian Air, I realized how close I'd come to oblivion. And yet here I was, alive to tell the story. The bright lights of the intensive care unit were nothing like the sterile hum of the cabin overhead. I woke on a narrow bed, tubes snaking into my arms, monitors beeping a steady rhythm that felt alien to my own heartbeat. My entire body ached as if I'd been flattened by a freight train, and in a way I had. The crash landing at Yakima Regional was miraculous, but it left me battered, bruised ribs, a mild concussion, and a sprained ankle that throbbed whenever I moved. Yet, despite the pain, nothing compared to the cold grip of survivors' guilt. Through the swirling haze of painkillers, fragments of voices reached me. A nurse, her face warm, her hands gentle, adjusted my blanket. "Mr. Harper, you're awake. You had quite the ordeal." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. Instead, I blinked, willing my mind to catch up to my body. Overhead, a wall-mounted clock read 3:14 a.m. It had been nearly 12 hours since we'd evacuated the aircraft. The nurse stepped back and gestured toward a framed photograph clipped to the curtain rail. My fiancée, Emma, smiling at her graduation. "She's been calling," the nurse said softly. Panic surged. "Emma?" I closed my eyes, fighting nausea, trying to remember whether I'd managed to call her after we landed. My phone lay on a tray table beside me, screen cracked, battery at 10%. I pressed the power button and saw a dozen missed calls and dozens more texts, all from Emma. My chest tightened. I tapped through them. "Jack, are you okay? I saw on the news. Please call me. I love you. Please." I dialed her number with trembling fingers. It rang twice before her voice, quivering, relieved, answered. "Jack, thank God." "Emma," I croaked, I'm alive." There was a pause filled with her sobs. "You promised me you'd come home." "I did," I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks. "But Maria, I closed my eyes. The mother, she didn't make it out." Emma's sobs cut through the line. I pressed the phone to my ear, letting her grief wash over me. As she cried, I realized it was only now that the enormity of what had happened truly hit me. 26 people on board, 25 lives lost, and me, alive. The police had moved swiftly, sealing off the tarmac and hauling away the twisted wreck of the cabin. Investigators combed the metal carcass, tracing fingerprints and tool marks along the torn flight control housings. I would later read their report. Maliciously slashed steel cables, cut with surgical precision, a premeditated attempt on every passenger and crew member, and only one heartbeat had remained. They called me in for questioning at dawn. 2 detectives, stern but compassionate, sat beside me, notebooks at the ready. One of them, Detective Ramirez, studied me through wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Harper, thank you for cooperating. We know this is difficult." I nodded, recalling the clinching moment when the cables severed. "I saw the wires, sparks. Then the fuselage jolted. I swear I saw them." The other detective, Sophia Chen, flipped through photographs. "You recognized one of the flight attendants mouthing to you." I swallowed. "She was trying to warn us." They leaned in. "Do you know her name?" "Tanya Lopez," I said. "She was in 12C. Detective Ramirez exchanged a look with Chen. "Thank you," he said gravely. "That information saved a life, Mr. Harper." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "She helped her daughter off the aircraft and then went back to assist others. Her sacrifice gave passengers extra seconds." My heart sank. Each second had been a blade. Life or death hung in the balance. I'd escaped while she remained, and for that, I burned with guilt. Back in my hospital bed, I tried to sleep, but nightmares stalked me. I was back on the wing, dangling above an endless void, wires sparking beneath my feet. I'd wake in panic, drenched in sweat, gasping for air that felt too thick. At times, I could almost feel Maria's grip on my arm, urging me forward, and then she was gone. Physical therapy began 3 days later. Each step I took with a walker seemed as precarious as walking on that damaged wing. I refused the wheelchair, determined not to surrender to fear. The therapist, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, cheered every small victory. "That's it, Jack. One more step." I forced a smile with each stab of pain. Between sessions, my mind circled the same question: why me? I'd flown countless times, I'd worn that same jacket, sat in that same seat, yet I was the only one who'd escaped death. Emails from Meridian Air's legal department arrived daily, requesting statements, medical records, and my phone logs. Insurance adjusters called about compensation. They spoke in clinical tones, sums of money, settlements, waivers. To them, this was a file. To me, it was a massacre. On the 6th day, I was discharged. Stepping outside, the late summer air felt electric. I hailed a cab and gave them my apartment address. As the cityscape of Seattle glided by, I grasped the taxi handle with white-knuckled hands, reconstructing the timeline in my head. Boarding at 2:15 p.m., the snap at 3:47 p.m., the landing at 4:09 p.m. I ran through every detail, desperate for answers I knew I'd never fully grasp. At home, Emma met me at the door. She wrapped me in an embrace so fierce it knocked the wind from my lungs. "You're alive," she whispered, as if saying it would make it true. I nodded, burying my face in her hair. "I know, but Maria isn't." Emma pulled back and held my face. "We'll tell her story, too." In that moment, amid my sorrow and relief, a purpose ignited within me. To honor the lives lost, to bear witness to Maria's sacrifice, and to unravel the truth behind the cable cutter. I glanced at the photo of Maria taped to my fridge, her daughter's hand in hers, eyes fierce with love. I traced her face with a trembling finger. "I won't let you be forgotten," I vowed. The following morning, I awoke to a knock at my apartment door. Detective Ramirez stood there, trenchcoat still damp from Seattle's relentless drizzle. He carried a manila folder stamped "Evidence." His expression was grave but determined. "Jack, we need you to come with us to the crash site," he said softly. "There's something you might recognize." My pulse quickened. I'd avoided the wreckage since leaving the ICU, afraid that witnessing the twisted fuselage up close would shatter what remained of my sanity. But I nodded and grabbed my jacket. Emma pressed against my side as we walked out, her hand a lifeline of comfort and strength. At Yakima Regional, we boarded a gray maintenance truck that rattled through the deserted tarmac. Wing fragments lay scattered like broken bones, their jagged edges stained with rust and soot. I swallowed, the smell of scorched metal and burned hydraulics ripping through me. A half-collapsed section of fuselage stood like a wounded animal, gaping and silent. Detective Chen guided me to a metal workbench strewn with cables, tools, and fragments of insulation. She pointed to a cluster of thin steel wires, twisted, cut, and frayed. "These were recovered early this morning," she explained. "We believe the saboteur returned to the scene after the crash. We found these cables sliced at precise angles, in a way that no accident could produce." I knelt beside them, my gloves sliding across the cut ends. The precision was almost surgical. No jagged tears, only clean, angled slices. My nightmare made flesh. I looked up as Emma slipped gently behind me, her hand on my shoulder. "What does it mean?" I whispered, voice barely above the roar of my own blood. Ramirez tapped the cables. "The original cuts were made at cruising altitude. These are post-crash. Evidence that someone tampered again, possibly to destroy our evidence." He paused. "We believe the technician, Martin Kowalski, returned to conceal his tracks, but your testimony and Tanya's sacrifice, gave us enough to arrest him before he could escape. I exhaled in relief, but relief twisted with guilt. Tanya's daughter Lily had lost her mother to save me. I felt her loss like a physical blow. Later that day, Emma and I stood beside Tanya's husband, Robert Lopez, a quiet man with salt and pepper hair and hollow eyes. He clutched a folded flag, an honor from the Yakima Honor Guard, and pressed it into my hands. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said, voice trembling. "You carry her story now." I bowed my head. I will never forget her. After the ceremony, Emma insisted we drive to the site of the sabotage, the Meridian Air Maintenance hangar on the outskirts of town. The building was secured under guard, but through a barred window I saw spare parts stacked like building blocks and workbenches lined in pristine order. It was there that Kowalski had planned our demise, where he had cut the cables with a hidden blade, hidden in plain sight among the tools. Inside the hangar, forensics teams dusted for prints and swabbed surfaces for DNA. A lone blueprint of Flight 214's wiring diagram hung on a corkboard, dotted with red pins marking each cut. The image was hypnotic and horrified me. A spider's web of interconnected lifelines, severed deliberately, turning a marvel of engineering into a death trap. Walking past the blueprint, I felt dizzy. Emma steadied me, and I traced the lines with my finger, imagining the knives slicing through the steel as we soared above the clouds. How calm he must have been, how cold, to kill us all. That night, back at home, insomnia carried me into the early hours. I stared at the ceiling, haunted by the echo of the captain's voice and the sight of Tanya's outstretched hand. I thought of Lily, now motherless, and of Maria, her real name, whose story I was determined to tell in full. Her laughter, her kindness, her final act of courage. I began to jot notes in a battered journal. October 14th, 2024. Sit with survivors, compile testimonies, interview families, gather flight records. By morning, the first rays of sunlight painted the pages gold. I realized that telling this story was more than catharsis. It was a duty, a way to give voice to the 25 souls who never reached home, and to the families shattered in an instant. Each chapter in my journal would be a tribute, a narrative stitched from memory, police reports, and personal interviews. Emma came in with 2 mugs of coffee, and I showed her my notes. She read silently, tears forming in her eyes. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "It's their legacy." I nodded, feeling a new resolve. The public would read headlines about the cable cutter and the lone survivor, but they would never know what happened in the trembling seconds before impact, or the bravery that flickered in the darkness like a candle's flame. And so Chapter 3 of our story closed, not in the wreckage of twisted metal, but in the quiet promise of remembrance. Tomorrow, I would begin the interviews, with first responders, with families, with the few who lived long enough to tell their own truths. Dawn broke over Seattle in soft, pearly light, the morning I met firefighter-paramedic Aaron Mills at Station 22. The bay doors opened to reveal the red gleam of Engine 22, its metal polished by years of service. Aaron, a stocky man with a gentle smile, guided me to the debrief room. His uniform still smelled faintly of smoke and antiseptic. He offered me coffee in a sturdy ceramic mug before he began. "October 14th was the day I'll never forget," he said, voice measured but edged with emotion. "We were paged at 3:50 p.m. for a possible crash at Yakima Regional. When we arrived, the scene looked like the aftermath of war." He paused, eyes distant. I scribbled notes: war zone, smoke rising, bodies strapped into seats. Aaron described how he and his team waded through debris, working methodically to cut away doors and extricate survivors. "Tanya's sacrifice gave us an opening," he explained. "Her efforts to free others delayed the wreckage's collapse. When we finally reached her row, the compartment had tightened like a vice. We couldn't move the fuselage any farther without risking a catastrophic shift. But some passengers had already crawled free, Jack among them." My pen stilled. He knew my name. "You were the first we saw," Aaron continued. "You were bleeding but conscious. You directed us to other pockets of survivors, people trapped under seats, wedged between mangled frames." He paused again, choking back a memory. "There was a little girl, no more than 6, calling for her mother. We found her under a seat, the only one still alive in that section. We wrapped her in a blanket. By then, the fire crews were on scene, working to cool the metal." He sighed heavily and folded his hands on the table. "We lost 25 souls that day, but the ones we saved owe their lives to the airline attendant who bought us time." I felt the tears welling, remembering Maria's face as she'd steered me forward. "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything." He nodded. "You're welcome." But it was a collective effort. Passengers, crew, and first responders. That's why it's so important we share every detail. Next, I flew to Dallas to meet with Dr. Evelyn Cho, the lead trauma surgeon at Baylor Regional Medical Center, where several survivors were treated. Her office smelled of antiseptic and was lined with diplomas. She greeted me in scrubs, exhaustion evident in her posture. "Your case was unusual," she said, tapping a chart. "Most crash victims present with massive trauma, internal bleeding, compound fractures, often beyond life-saving measures. But Mr. Harper, your injuries were painful but survivable. Your rapid evacuation and the swift arrival of paramedics played a crucial role." She studied me closely. "You also received a high-flow oxygen mask en route, which stabilized your breathing despite the cabin pressure changes. And of course, you had no severe head trauma." I nodded, recalling the heat in my ears as I slid out onto the tarmac. "Every second counted," she concluded. "The worst cases arrive after the golden hour. You made it in 43 minutes. I realized then how fragile survival could be. A confluence of luck, preparation, and the compassion of strangers." Dr. Cho's words etched into my mind as I thanked her and walked back into the Texas sun, feeling both humbled and resolved. Back in Seattle, I arranged to meet Lily Lopez at a small cafe near Pioneer Square. Lily, now 8, sat at a corner table, coloring fervently. Her dark curls fell over her forehead as she concentrated. When I approached, she looked up, clutching a drawing of an airplane with a bandaged heart. "Hi, Lily," I said softly. She slid the drawing across the table. "This is Mama's plane," she explained, pointing to the heart. "She saved me. I want to help you." Her eyes, both innocent and wise beyond her years, pierced me with their depth. "Will you tell her story?" she asked, voice small but determined. I knelt beside her. "Yes, Lily, every word." She smiled and handed me the drawing. "Mama says you're brave." My throat tightened. "So are you." We spent hours talking about her memories of her mother's laughter, the lullabies she sang, the way she tucked Lily's hair behind her ear. Lily described the moment the cabin lurched and her mother's strong hand guiding her toward the aisle. "She never let go," Lily said. "Even when the lights flickered, she kept smiling." That evening, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by photos and notes. I laid Maria's drawing beside my journal and wrote, "Interview with Lily Lopez, her mother's unwavering courage in the face of fear." I realized that these personal accounts, Aaron's valor, Dr. Cho's expertise, Lily's love, were the threads that would weave together the tapestry of truth. Each perspective offered a different facet of that fateful day. As the clock edged toward midnight, I mapped out the next steps: interviews with the captain and co-pilot, conversations with Meridian Air executives, and a meeting with the special prosecutor. The words formed in my mind like stepping stones across a river. Chapter 5. The Flight Deck Confessions. Before I closed my notebook, I whispered a promise to Maria, to Tanya, to every soul who didn't make it home. Your story will be heard. When Detective Ramirez called to say the captain and first officer were ready to speak, my chest tightened. The thought of stepping into an aircraft cockpit again, this time as an investigator, felt surreal. Yet I knew their testimony would illuminate the final seconds before impact. On a crisp morning in Seattle, Emma and I drove to Meridian Air's headquarters, a glass facade reflecting the Pacific Northwest sky. Inside the executive briefing room, I found Captain Robert Bob Sinclair and First Officer Elena Reyes waiting, their uniforms pressed, faces solemn. Captain Sinclair was a veteran with over 20 years of flight time, his silver hair cropped short. He offered a firm handshake. "Jack," he said quietly, "thank you for coming. We owe you our lives." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. First Officer Reyes, younger and equally reserved, joined us. "Our priority is safety and truth," she said. "We want to make sure the public understands exactly what happened." Her calm demeanor contrasted with the storm inside me. We sat around a polished conference table. Captain Sinclair cleared his throat. Flight 214 departed Seattle-Tacoma at 2:30 p.m. Clear skies, normal climb. We reached FL 350, 35,000 feet, by 3:05 p.m. All instruments indicated nominal performance. Then, at 3:47 p.m., I heard a loud pop, immediately followed by severe roll oscillations. He paused, eyes distant. I yelled to Elena, "We're losing roll authority." I grabbed the yoke and pushed opposite, but the control column felt dead. The wing was dipping uncontrollably. First Officer Reyes chimed in. I switched to the standby hydraulic pump and attempted to engage alternate roll control, but the aileron cables were severed. We had none of the primary or backup systems. Our only option was a raise of flaps to increase drag and help stabilize, then declare an emergency and divert. She pointed to a detailed flight data recorder transcript on a screen. You can see the stick shaker and autopilot disengagement at 3:47:12. Manual control failed at 3:47:18. She tapped the timestamp. 6 seconds of jury-rigged hydraulics. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. 6 seconds. "And then?" I whispered. Sinclair's voice cracked. "We informed ATC of our situation. Mayday, mayday, lost roll control, diverting to Yakima. I trimmed to neutral and leveled as best I could. At 3:49 p.m. we began descent. The cabin dropped sharply, oxygen masks deployed. The fuselage shuddered with each adjustment." He swallowed. "I never thought we'd make it." I pointed to the transcript. "Was there any warning or sign the cables had been tampered with before that pop?" First Officer Reyes shook her head. "No. Inspection record showed cables replaced and tested 3 weeks prior. Everything passed. There were no anomalies in the pre-flight walk-around or in the maintenance logs. Until I saw the cuts at the scene," I muttered, recalling the precision of each slice. Captain Sinclair nodded. "When the wreckage was examined, the cuts were consistent with surgical blades rather than wear or corrosion. We flew blind." Emma reached for my hand. "Together, we absorbed the gravity of their words. An act of malice had stripped the pilots of tools they depended on, turning a routine flight into a battle for survival." They continued. "The descent into Yakima was brutal," said Reyes. "We drifted left as we lost lift on the right wing, but we managed a controlled glide. Bob guided us to runway 11, touchdown at 4:09 p.m. Captain Sinclair's eyes glistened. I held it until the last moment, knowing that if we landed nose first, it would have been catastrophic. We landed on 2 wheels, the fuselage scraping, sparks flying. The structure held just long enough. I exhaled, remembering the roar as the plane kissed the runway. "Your action saved us all," I said, voice thick. Sinclair shook his head. "No, Maria's action saved us. You and she gave us extra seconds to line up the runway. Without her, I don't know if I could have kept us level." I closed my eyes, tears welling at their shared humility. Here were 2 professionals confronting both the terror of the skies and the betrayal of one of their own ground crew. Before leaving, Captain Sinclair handed me a folded sheaf of annotated cockpit voice recorder transcripts. "We've marked each moment of critical decision. Take it, make sure the world knows how close we came." Back home that night, I spread the transcripts across my dining table. The cockpit voices, brisk, calm, resolute, filled the silence of my apartment. I listened through tears. The crackle of the intercom, Sinclair's clipped commands, Reyes's calm confirmations. Layered beneath was the ever-present rattle of a wounded aircraft fighting for stability. Each phrase was a testament to professionalism amid chaos. By 2:30 a.m., I'd transcribed key excerpts into my journal. 3:47:12, pop. 3:47:18, hydraulic backup engaged. 3:50:05, Mayday declared. 3:49:45, flaps raised. 4:09:03, touchdown. The exactitude of time felt sacred, each second a heartbeat that had kept us from oblivion. I closed my notebook and whispered a final vow. Your voices will echo, Captain Sinclair, First Officer Reyes, throughout history. As the first light of dawn pierced my blinds, I knew Chapter 5 was complete. Tomorrow, I would delve into the courtroom drama. The prosecution's case against Martin Kowalski, the defense's arguments, and the moral reckoning of a man who had weaponized a tool he once used to save lives. The courthouse loomed over Seattle's downtown like a monolith of justice and dread. As I climbed the worn stone steps, my heart pounded with every echo of my own footsteps. Today, the trial of Martin Kowalski, the Meridian Air technician turned saboteur, would finally begin. Over the past weeks, I'd prepared my testimony, written op-eds, and spoken with lawyers, but nothing could steel me for the courtroom's stark reality. Seats filled with bereaved families, cables draped in evidence boxes, and behind the defense table, Kowalski himself, stony-faced, clad in a grey suit that hung off his gaunt frame. Inside, the hush was suffocating. The judge, a tall woman with silver hair and steely eyes, called the court to order. The prosecution team rose, Assistant U.S. Attorney Mark Reynolds in a Navy suit, flanked by Meridian Air's lead counsel. They placed a polished wooden box on the evidence table and snapped it open, revealing a bundle of severed steel cables, the very lifelines Kowalski had cut. The judge peered over her glasses. Mr. Reynolds, your first witness. Reynolds turned and locked eyes with me. My throat tightened, but I forced a nod. As I took the stand, the courtroom's gallery fell silent, save for the soft creak of the wooden bench. The bailiff swore me in. I raised my right hand, heart pounding, as if bracing for the moment when the world would shatter again. Reynolds began gently. Mr. Harper, can you tell the court where you were on October 14th, 2024? I took a breath. I was a passenger aboard Meridian Air Flight 214, Seattle to Dallas. I sat in seat 12B. He leaned forward. What happened at cruising altitude? I recalled the snap, the flash of sparks on the wing, the rush of panic in my chest. The aileron cables had been cut. The plane lurched violently. Sparks flew from the exposed wires. The captain declared an emergency and diverted to Yakima Regional. Throughout my testimony, I felt every eye on me. Families who had lost spouses, parents, siblings. I knew they searched my face for answers, for proof that their loved ones hadn't suffered in vain. I described Maria's sacrifice, how Tanya Lopez had guided me toward the aisle, giving me the extra seconds I needed to cling to life. The courtroom was hushed, tears glinting in some eyes, silent sobs in others. When I finished, Reynolds gently moved to the next exhibit. Maintenance logs, bar-coded and stamped, with entries in Kowalski's handwriting noting control cable inspection, dated 2 days before the flight. Then a series of security camera snapshots, Kowalski entering the hangar late at night, carrying a small toolkit, returning with oil-stained gloves. Each image was a punch to the gut. I could almost feel the blade in his hand as he sliced through the steel that bound us mid-air. Finally, the prosecution rested. The defense attorney, Rosalind Green, rose with a composed smile. She circled me like a shark, eyes calculating. Mr. Harper, are you absolutely certain you saw cables cutting through? She asked, her tone honeyed yet sharp. I took a breath. I saw them sparking, frayed, dangling like severed nerves. She nodded slowly. But you did not actually witness Mr. Kowalski cutting them, correct? I hesitated, remembering the darkness of the hangar, the glint of metal under fluorescent lights. No, I didn't see him directly, I admitted. But the forensic analysis, she interrupted. Forensic analysis that you did not conduct yourself. She tapped her notes. How do we know those cable fragments didn't result from crash damage instead of premeditated sabotage? Murmurs trembled through the courtroom. My stomach knotted. The cables lay in that box like a grisly bouquet, cut at perfect angles. I recalled Detective Ramirez kneeling before them at the tarmac. I knew they were sliced long before the fuselage hit the ground. Reynolds stood and approached. Your Honor, may I? The judge nodded. He retrieved a forensic report, a black and white microphotograph showing the beveled edge of a cable cut, the smooth diagonal slice inconsistent with crash-induced tears. He displayed it with a laser pointer, the diagonal cut face, the compression marks from a blade. This is a saboteur's signature, he declared. No accident would produce such precision. The defense attorney scowled but said no more. Over the next 2 days, testimonies streamed in. The lead forensic metallurgist describing microscopic tool marks. Tanya's husband, Robert Lopez, recounting the last phone call with his wife. Lily's letter read aloud by her aunt, describing her mother's brave smile as the cabin trembled. Each account built a mosaic of sacrifice and cruelty. On the final afternoon, the jury filed back in. The judge read instructions on evaluating evidence of intent and malice. My palms sweated as I listened. I knew families were praying for justice. When the doors finally closed, the jurors began deliberations. Hours passed like lifetimes. I paced the hallway, Emma's hand in mine, both of us clutching a wooden cross she'd given me, inscribed with Maria's name. At 6:45 p.m., the jury filed in. The foreperson stood. The judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson's voice was steady. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Mr. Harper, step forward." My legs trembled as I returned to the stand. The foreperson cleared her throat. "In the matter of the United States versus Martin Kowalski, we find the defendant guilty on all counts: sabotage, attempted murder, and recklessly endangering an aircraft." A collective exhale filled the courtroom. I closed my eyes as tears flooded down my cheeks. Tears for the families, for Tanya's daughter, for Maria's memory. The judge thanked the jury and called the courtroom adjourned. Outside, the dusk sky blended into streetlights. As we descended the courthouse steps, Emma wrapped her arms around me. "It's done," she whispered. I nodded, voice choked. But the work continues. I thought of Chapter 7, where I would explore the aftermath, how families rebuilt, how Meridian Air overhauled safety, and how one man's evil deed reshaped an industry. And so, with justice served, I closed Chapter 6 of our story, carrying the weight of 25 lives and the promise of remembrance forward into the night. In the weeks after the verdict, the air around me felt different, charged with tension and relief, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I returned to my apartment with Emma. The weight of the trial lifted from my shoulders, but the journey ahead still long. Families of the victims gathered in living rooms and memorial gardens, clutching one another in sorrow and solidarity. Meridian Air, humbled by its negligence, launched a worldwide safety overhaul, replacing cable systems with advanced fly-by-wire controls and instituting stringent overnight security protocols in every maintenance hangar. On a crisp November morning, I joined a panel discussion at the Federal Aviation Administration's Seattle Regional Office. The auditorium was filled with airline executives, safety inspectors, and maintenance technicians. At the podium, I shared the lessons learned from Flight 214, not as abstract bullet points, but as real memories. The jolt of betrayal when I saw the frayed wires, the selfless courage of Tanya Lopez, the calculated malice of Martin Kowalski. I spoke of faith in our fellow human beings and the imperative to protect that trust at every turn. My purpose, I told the audience, is not to condemn an industry that saves millions of lives every year. It is to remind us all that vigilance must accompany innovation. Safety is both technology and humanity. Steel cables are nothing without the integrity of the people who handle them. My words drew a somber silence, then applause that echoed like a promise of change. That afternoon, I visited the Lopez family home in Yakima. Lily, now 8, greeted me with a shy smile and a new drawing, this time her mother ascending through a sky of billowing clouds, surrounded by golden light. Robert handed me a framed photo of Tanya in her flight attendant uniform, her face radiant. "She would have been proud," he said, voice thick with emotion. We sat at the kitchen table sharing memories, how Tanya loved baking pumpkin bread for her daughter, how she volunteered at the local shelter, how her laughter could fill a room. We cried and laughed in the same breath, honoring a life that shone too brightly to be dimmed by death. Meanwhile, in Dallas, I attended the annual reunion of crash survivors at Baylor Regional Medical Center. Dr. Evelyn Cho and her team greeted me warmly. The lobby bustled with survivors who had come from across the country, some hobbling on canes, others with the faintest of scars. We shared our stories, the terror in the cabin, the kindness of strangers, the resilience that carried us home. A memorial plaque now hung in the hospital's main corridor, inscribed with the names of all 25 victims. Each time I walked past it, I traced the letters with my eyes, murmuring their names as if to keep them alive. At home, Emma and I transformed the spare bedroom into a writing studio. I spread out my notes, transcripts, and interviews across a large oak desk. My journal entries had grown into hundreds of pages, each one a stepping stone toward understanding. I drafted Chapter 8, tentatively titled Healing Wounds, to explore how survivors and families coped in the months after the tragedy. There was the story of Michael Carter, who founded Wings of Hope, a non-profit providing counseling to airline disaster survivors. He had lost his wife on Flight 214, but channeled his grief into offering others a path forward. There was the story of Captain Sinclair, who returned to the cockpit with a new resolve to champion safety reforms, his hands steady on the yoke once more. Throughout this process, I felt the steady presence of Maria and Tanya guiding my pen. Their voices whispered through my words, "Remember me, remember all of us." I often found myself pausing to look at their photographs, Maria's warm smile, Tanya's fierce eyes, drawn to the humanity behind the headlines. One evening, as snow began to fall in Seattle, I hosted a small gathering of survivors, family members, and first responders in my living room. We lit candles and passed around a single journal, inviting each person to write a memory, a tribute, or a message of hope. Lily Lopez drew a heart and wrote, "Mama is my guardian angel." Aaron Mills scribbled the date and pledged, "Never forget." Dr. Cho left a note in neat handwriting, "Every life counts." When it was my turn, I wrote, "We carry their stories forward so that no act of terror ever goes unchallenged." By the end of the night, the room glowed with shared grief and newfound strength. We realized that our collective story, woven from acts of courage, sacrifice, and compassion, would be more powerful than any act of hate. As Chapter 7 closed, I stared at the flickering candlelight and felt a quiet resolve settle in my chest. The journey was far from over. There were more voices to uplift, more lessons to share, and more hearts to mend. Tomorrow, I would begin Chapter 8, focusing on how Flight 214's legacy inspired a wave of safety innovations and community support programs. And with each word, I would honor the 25 souls who never made it home and the selfless heroes who gave their lives to save strangers. The light in the writing studio was soft and golden as dawn filtered through the curtains. I sat at my oak desk, pen in hand, ready to chronicle the stories of renewal that had sprung from the tragedy of Flight 214. Healing, I had come to understand, was not a single act, but a journey of countless small steps taken by survivors, families, medical teams, and entire communities. In Chapter 8, each story would serve as proof that even the most devastating events could inspire transformation. Wings of Hope and the Power of Community. Michael Carter, widower, father, and survivor, had turned his personal tragedy into a beacon for others. In early 2025, he formally launched Wings of Hope, a non-profit dedicated to providing free counseling, peer support groups, and emergency grants to anyone affected by an airline disaster. I visited Michael at his office in Boise, a bright, open space filled with airplane models and photos of survivors smiling. He told me how the first peer group, held just months after the crash, had brought together 10 survivors and 8 family members. "I remember sitting in a circle with people I'd never met," Michael said, voice steady, "and hearing their stories, some eerily similar to mine, others completely different. One woman spoke of being trapped under a seat and singing lullabies to calm her own panic. Another described how a stranger pulled her to safety, even though they'd never spoken. In that room, we realized we shared more than trauma. We had a bond that could carry us forward." By June 2025, Wings of Hope had expanded to 10 chapters nationwide, with more than 500 active participants. They organized annual remembrance flights, chartered aircraft that flew the same route as Flight 214, carrying survivors, family members, pilots, and flight attendants in a gesture of unity and respect. On board, participants shared stories, wrote messages to the lost, and released eco-friendly sky lanterns at cruise altitude, each one a tribute that drifted silently into the sunset. Innovation in flight safety. The sabotage of Flight 214 had exposed a critical vulnerability, reliance on mechanical cables that, while robust under normal conditions, could be compromised by malicious tampering. In response, Meridian Air and several other major carriers accelerated their adoption of fly-by-wire technology, electronic flight control systems that eliminate physical cables in favor of digital signals. At an aerospace conference in Toulouse, France, I spoke with Dr. Claire Montague, lead engineer for Meridian's retrofit program. She showed me a scale model of an Airbus A320 equipped with redundant fiber optic signal paths and encrypted data links. "Our new systems include at least 5 independent signal channels," Dr. Montague explained, "so that if one is disrupted, the others maintain control. We've also installed tamper-evident seals on all avionics panels, real-time integrity monitoring software, and automated diagnostic alerts that notify ground crews if anything looks abnormal." By mid-2025, over 200 aircraft in Meridian's fleet had been upgraded. Other airlines followed suit, and regulators in the United States and Europe introduced mandatory tamper detection requirements for all commercial carriers. The aviation industry, once reluctant to adopt widespread digital controls, embraced modernization with remarkable speed, proof that a single act of sabotage could ripple outward to make every passenger safer. Legislative changes and industry standards. Not all battles were fought in hangars or boardrooms. Some were waged in legislative chambers. Senator Maria Alvarez of Washington State, whose district included Yakima, introduced the Aircraft Maintenance and Security Act, AMSA, in January 2025. The bill mandated 24-hour authenticated access logs for all maintenance areas, enhanced background checks, and periodic psychological evaluations for all technicians. Real-time video surveillance in every hangar, with encrypted recordings preserved for a minimum of 5 years. Whistleblower protection and a federally managed safety hotline. Senator Alvarez told me, "When I met with families of the victims, I heard the same refrain. We never knew someone could do this. We owe it to every traveler to close that gap in security." The AMSA passed with bipartisan support and became law in June 2025, setting a new global benchmark for airline safety and maintenance integrity. Personal journeys of resilience. Amid these sweeping changes, individual stories of perseverance emerged. Captain Sinclair returned to the cockpit in April 2025, flying a brand new fly-by-wire-equipped Airbus on a test route. He described the experience as surreal, like flying a new generation of aircraft with the ghost of two-seat routine looking over my shoulder. Dr. Evelyn Cho spearheaded the creation of a specialized trauma recovery clinic at Baylor Regional, combining physical rehabilitation with cognitive behavioral therapy and virtual reality simulations to help survivors confront and process their memories. Aaron Mills and his fellow first responders established the Rescue Heroes Fund, providing grants for specialized equipment and ongoing mental health support for firefighters and paramedics who responded to disasters. Each of these narratives underscored a vital truth. Healing is both technological and deeply human, a legacy of remembrance. As Chapter 8 drew to a close, I reflected on the mosaic of stories I had gathered. The sky lanterns, the upgraded aircraft, the legislative reforms, the survivors' support networks, all these threads wove together into a tapestry that honored the 25 lost souls and celebrated the strength of those who remained. I wrote the final lines of the chapter by candlelight one evening, echoing the remembrance gathering in my living room. In every cable sealed, in every regulation passed, in every comforting word exchanged in a peer circle, their memory lives on. The tragedy of Flight 214 became a catalyst for change, proof that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can rise, rebuild, and soar once more. I closed my journal and looked at the framed drawing of Maria and the photograph of Tanya on my desk. Their presence felt as real as the pen in my hand. "This is your legacy," I whispered. "A world made safer because of your sacrifice." The morning light filtered softly through the drapes as I sipped my coffee and reviewed the transcripts I'd gathered for this chapter. Chapter 9 would explore the deepest reckonings of trauma and the unexpected paths toward hope that emerged from the darkness of Flight 214. I focused on 3 intertwined stories: Jack Harper's own healing journey, the continuing growth of Lily Lopez, and the collective memory that bound survivors together. Jack Harper, beyond survivor. Since the trial, my life had shifted from passive reflection to active advocacy. Mornings began with calls to journalists and safety experts. Afternoons were devoted to writing articles and preparing presentations. Evenings were spent at support group meetings or on the phone with families. Yet despite the busy schedule, a shadow clung to me, an undercurrent of guilt that refused to fade. I found myself drawn back to the crash site more often than I could explain. Standing before the twisted fuselage fragments on the tarmac of Yakima Regional, I traced the lines where cables once ran, imagining the terrible precision with which they'd been severed. Each visit was a pilgrimage, a way to touch the memory of those who died and to confront the question that haunted me most. Why was I spared? One late autumn afternoon, I stood alone beside a weathered memorial plaque at the airport. The wind stirred the pages of my journal, and I opened to a blank spread. I wrote, "Survivor's guilt is an echo that never quiets. It asks why one life was chosen over 25, but perhaps the answer lies not in why, but in what becomes of the spared." As I wrote, tears blurred the ink. In that moment, I realized that my purpose was not only to tell a story, but to live one, to channel my survival into meaningful action. I closed the journal and placed my hand over the names etched in bronze, vowing to carry their memory forward in every speech, every article, every conversation. Lily Lopez, Growing Wings. At 8 years old, Lily's resilience was nothing short of miraculous. When I visited her school one chilly morning, she greeted me not as a victim, but as a mentor. Her teacher had invited me to speak about courage in front of her third-grade class. As I stepped to the podium, 30 pairs of curious eyes watched me. I spoke of Lily's mother, how, in those terrifying seconds, she'd held her daughter close and guided her towards safety. Then I asked the children, "What does courage mean to you?" Hands shot up and answers poured forth, helping someone who fell on the playground, standing up when others are being unkind, trying something new even if you're scared. Each answer, simple and pure, reminded me that bravery is not only the domain of flight attendants or pilots, but of every heart that dares to hope in the face of fear. Afterward, Lily approached me, her smile bright beneath her dark curls. "Thank you," she whispered. "My mom would be proud." I knelt to hug her, realizing that she too was teaching me how to grow beyond survival, to transform trauma into compassion and action. Collective memory, building a living archive. On a crisp December evening, I joined Aaron Mills, Dr. Evelyn Cho, Michael Carter, and several survivors at the Seattle History Museum. We were there to inaugurate the Flight 214 Living Archive, a digital repository of testimonies, photographs, cockpit audio clips, and personal artifacts donated by families. The archive's interactive kiosk displayed a looping collage, an engine's hum, a flight attendant's voice, Lily's drawing, snippets of courtroom dialogue. Standing before the exhibit, I watched visitors, some wiping tears, others nodding in solemn understanding, as they explored each memory. A young man pressed his fingers to the screen where my own journal entry was displayed. He leaned close, reading my words. In every cable sealed, in every regulation passed, in every comforting word exchanged, their memory lives on. At that moment, I felt the power of a shared story, the way individual memories, when woven together, become an enduring tapestry that resists both oblivion and hatred. Later, as the museum lights dimmed, Aaron and I walked the exhibit one last time. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've done more than tell a story," he said. "You've given us a home for our grief and our hope, toward a future of renewal." As Chapter 9 drew to a close, I sat in my writing studio surrounded by the artifacts of remembrance, a fragment of fuselage sealed in glass, Lily's latest drawing, Tanya's folded flag. I reflected on the journey from that single moment of terror, the snap of steel, the flash of sparks, to this burgeoning community of resilience. I typed the closing lines, "Survival is not an endpoint but a testament. It demands that we live not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot. In sharing our stories, we forge connections that time cannot erode, and through our collective memory, we ensure that courage outlives tragedy." I paused, fingers hovering above the keys. Tomorrow, I would begin Chapter 10. A deep dive into the global impact of Flight 214, tracing how one act of sabotage reshaped aviation safety standards and inspired new research into aircraft security. But for now, I closed my laptop and allowed myself a moment of quiet gratitude for Emma's steadfast love, for Maria's and Tanya's undying courage, and for the unexpected gift of life that had become my greatest responsibility. Dawn broke over Geneva as I arrived at the International Civil Aviation Organization's gleaming glass tower. After weeks spent gathering personal stories and local reforms in the United States, I was eager to explore how Flight 214's tragedy had rippled across borders, reshaping aviation safety worldwide. In the lobby, a mosaic of national flags waved gently in the morning breeze, symbols of cooperation and shared purpose. I straightened my notes and stepped into the ICAO's high-ceilinged conference hall, where delegates from over 190 countries had gathered for an emergency session on aircraft maintenance integrity. I took my seat at one of the polished wooden tables, flanked by regulators from Brazil, Japan, South Africa, and Germany. The conversation began with a tense report from ICAO Secretary General Li Wei, whose measured voice carried the weight of recent events. The sabotage of Meridian Air Flight 214 has exposed vulnerabilities not only in cable-based control systems, but in the trust we place in every individual with access to an aircraft. Today, we must forge new standards that transcend borders and languages. As the meeting progressed, technical experts presented data on the accelerated adoption of fly-by-wire systems, now mandated for any commercial aircraft over 15 years of age. Safety engineers from Airbus and Boeing demonstrated the latest tamper-evident hardware: self-sealing panels, fiber-optic integrity sensors, and digital heartbeat monitors that broadcast continual system health checks to ground control. I watched animatedly as Japanese delegate Dr. Hana Saito showed a short video of a simulated cable-cut attack thwarted by autonomous electronic overrides, followed by a live demonstration of a maintenance technician's smart ID badge that logs and blocks any unscheduled access to critical control panels. Between sessions, I interviewed several delegates. Carlos Mendes, head of Brazil's National Civil Aviation Agency, spoke of his country's new Flight 214 Memorial Scholarship, which funds engineering students to research aviation security innovations. Our hope, he said, is that by investing in young talent, we can prevent future tragedies. Whenever a student receives this scholarship, they carry with them the memory of Flight 214 and the responsibility to build a safer sky. Across the aisle, Dr. Amina Jallo from South Africa described her government's community-based reporting network, which encourages airline employees to anonymously flag concerns about maintenance practices. Fear of retaliation kept many silent, she explained, but now, with guaranteed protection and a direct line to ICAO, technicians feel empowered to speak up. Later that afternoon, I joined a working group on psychological screening and support for maintenance personnel. Here, Norway's aviation psychologist, Dr. Erik Lund, presented his team's research showing that periodic mental health assessments reduce insider risk by nearly 40%. His slides illustrated a voluntary wellness portal app that offers confidential counseling, stress management resources, and peer support forums specifically for airline staff. I noted his conclusion: physical security measures are vital, but they must be matched by attention to the minds and hearts of those we trust with every flight. As the plenary reconvened, Secretary General Lee summarized the day's achievements. Global Maintenance Access Standards, a unified protocol for electronic access controls, requiring multi-factor authentication and real-time logging for all critical systems. Tamper detection certification, mandatory installation of tamper-evident hardware on all in-service commercial aircraft by December 2026. International whistleblower protection, an ICAO-managed hotline and legal safeguards for maintenance personnel who report safety concerns, mental health screening guidelines, a framework for regular psychological evaluations and support programs for all technicians and ground crew. Delegates rose in applause, a rare moment of unanimity across such a diverse assembly. I felt the surge of hope that technology and policy could unite to honor the victims of Flight 214 by preventing future sabotage. That evening, I walked along the shores of Lake Geneva, mulling over the day's whirlwind of technical jargon and diplomatic breakthroughs. The setting sun gilded the water, and I thought of the families I'd met back home, the Lopezes, the Carters, the Sinclairs. Their grief had fueled this global effort, turning personal loss into collective determination. My final appointment in Geneva was with Ambassador Marie Dubois, France's permanent representative to ICAO. She invited me to her office atop the Palais des Nations, where walls lined with historic aviation artifacts seemed to whisper stories of triumph and tragedy. Over tea, she reflected on the broader meaning of Flight 214's legacy. Air travel connects us all, but it also requires trust at every level, trust in engineers, pilots, regulators, and in each other's integrity. Flight 214 reminded us that no single nation or company can ensure safety alone. We must build a shared culture of vigilance and compassion. Her words resonated deeply. From the fractured fuselage at Yakima to the marble halls of ECAO, the story of Flight 214 had become a bridge between private grief and public policy, between local heroism and international reform. On my last morning in Geneva, I stood before the United Nations flag in the ICAO lobby and penned the opening lines of Chapter 11. When 26 souls were imperiled over the Pacific Northwest, the world watched and then acted. Flight 214's story is not merely a chronicle of fear and loss, but a testament to our capacity for renewal, collaboration, and hope. I close my notebook, slipping in photographs of the ICAO session and the smiling faces of delegates from every continent. As I boarded the flight back to Seattle, I felt the familiar hum of engines beneath my seat, once a source of terror, now a symbol of progress. Each mile flown carried the echoes of policy debates, technical breakthroughs, and human resolve. And with every passing cloud, I held fast to the promise that the lessons of Flight 214 would continue to guide our collective flight toward a safer tomorrow. The first snow of December had fallen in Seattle when I realized that Flight 214's legacy was no longer confined to hangar doors or courtroom transcripts. It had become woven into everyday conversations about safety, trust, and the human spirit. Chapter 11 unfolds at the intersection of remembrance and renewal, showing how individuals and institutions alike carry the story forward, years after that fateful afternoon. A living memorial on the water. On the morning of December 14, 2025, exactly 1 year after Flight 214's emergency landing, dozens of survivors and family members gathered at Green Lake Park. Armed with hot coffee and wool blankets, we faced the wind-whipped surface of the water. Michael Carter, whose non-profit Wings of Hope had blossomed into a national network, stood at the water's edge beside me. "Today," he began, voice clear against the whispering geese, "we honor those we lost by setting free what we cannot keep." He handed each participant a small biodegradable lantern, an orb of rice paper containing a flickering LED, and a handwritten note. The notes bore names, memories, and messages of love. Tanya Lopez, your courage lights our way. Pilot Sinclair, your professionalism guided us home. Never forget, so we never repeat. At precisely 2:47 p.m., the moment the cables were cut a year ago, we lit our lanterns. In unison, we released them onto the water. The lake's still surface reflected hundreds of softly glowing lights, drifting slowly toward the shore before disappearing beneath the ripples. There was a hush broken only by quiet sobs and the satisfied crack of ice forming at the lake's edges. I thought of Lily Lopez watching from her mother's shoulders as her lantern bobbed away. Her dark curls framed her face, tears glistening as she whispered, "Mama, look." And in that moment I understood that memory was not sadness alone, but a living bridge between past and future. A promise that these lives, though ended too soon, would never be forgotten. The annual Safety Summit. 3 days after the memorial, I traveled to Chicago for the 5th Annual Global Aviation Safety Summit, where Flight 214's lessons were a central theme. In the main hall of McCormick Place, banners displayed the summit slogan, "Learn, Innovate, Protect." I sat on a panel with Captain Sinclair, Dr. Claire Montague, and Senator Maria Alvarez, each of us offering a different perspective on progress over the past year. Captain Sinclair spoke first. "Our industry has always been about advancement," he said, "but never has one incident spurred so much rapid change. Fly-by-wire retrofits, enhanced maintenance protocols, and mental health support for technicians. These were once ideas on a whiteboard. Now they're standards." Dr. Montague followed, presenting data from Meridian Air's retrofit program, a 70% reduction in mechanical control-related incidents, 0 unauthorized access violations reported, and near total compliance with tamper detection requirements across major carriers. She described new developments, self-healing cable alloys that can detect and repair microfractures, and AI-driven monitoring systems that flag anomalies in hydraulic pressure before human eyes notice them. Senator Alvarez closed the discussion with a call to action. Legislation is effective only if it evolves. We must remain vigilant, adjust regulations as technology advances, and ensure airlines worldwide adopt these measures, not just those in wealthier nations. As the audience applauded, I realized that the true measure of Flight 214's legacy was not merely in rules passed or hardware installed, but in the ongoing commitment of this global community to learn from tragedy and protect every passenger who steps aboard an aircraft. Voices from the heart back in Seattle, I continued to collect personal narratives, convinced that the human element must remain at the center of this story. I spent an afternoon with Maria Nguyen, a young flight attendant who had joined Meridian Air 6 months after the incident. Over pastries at Pike Place Market, she told me why she had chosen this profession despite knowing the risks. "Every time I deliver those safety demonstrations," she said, "I think of Tanya. I feel her presence reminding me that these words, fasten your seatbelt, locate your nearest exit, aren't just protocol. They're lifelines." Her eyes glistened as she recited the emergency briefing with passionate precision, and I felt the weight of responsibility she carried for every passenger. It was a poignant reminder that the selflessness of one attendant inspired an entire generation of crew members to embrace their duty with renewed dedication, building the next generation. In the months that followed, I worked with the non-profit Aviation Futures to launch the Cable Cutter Scholarship, a fund supporting engineering students and maintenance trainees from underrepresented communities. The idea was simple: transform the darkest chapter of Flight 214 into an opportunity for innovation and diversity in aviation. At the inaugural awards ceremony in January 2026, 20 young men and women received grants, mentorship, and internship placements with major airlines. One recipient, Aisha Hassan, stood before the crowd and spoke of her dreams. "I lost my uncle in that crash," she said, voice steady, "but I decided not to be defined by loss. With this scholarship, I'll help design stronger, smarter systems so no family ever endures what mine did." Her words resonated like a beacon of hope, proof that the legacy of Flight 214 extended far beyond my journal, into classrooms and hangars where the next breakthroughs would be born. As Chapter 11 closed, I sat at my desk surrounded by lantern sketches, scholarship applications, and summit brochures. The tapestry of stories, of remembrance, innovation, and education had grown richer and more complex. I typed the final lines. From the waters of Green Lake to the halls of international summits, Flight 214's impact has transcended tragedy. It has become a living narrative of resilience, a call to action, and a promise to every traveler that we will remember, we will improve, and we will never let fear silence our hope. I looked up at the framed photo of the lanterns floating on Green Lake. Their lights mirrored in my eyes. Tomorrow, I would begin the final chapter, Chapter 12, the culmination of our journey. A synthesis of lessons learned, an exploration of what it means to live in a world forever changed by Flight 214, and a vision for a future where every flight is honored by vigilance, compassion, and unity. As dawn broke over Seattle one last time in this narrative journey, I sat at my desk surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of a year's work. Transcripts, interviews, sketches, lantern photographs, scholarship applications, and the worn journal in which I first scrawled fragments of memory. Chapter 12 would be the culmination, a synthesis of everything learned, an exploration of what it means to live in a world reshaped by Flight 214, and a hopeful vision for the future of aviation and human connection. Synthesis of lessons learned. Flight 214 taught us that safety is never singular. It is woven from multiple threads: human integrity, The deliberate act of sabotage by Martin Kowalski underscored that technology alone cannot guarantee safety. It must be paired with robust security culture, ethical training, and ongoing psychological support for maintenance personnel. The AMSA legislation, ICAO protocols, and whistleblower hotlines ensure that every individual entrusted with an aircraft is continuously vetted and empowered to speak up without fear. Technological innovation. The swift shift from mechanical cables to fly-by-wire systems, tamper-evident hardware, real-time health monitoring, and AI-driven anomaly detection transformed aviation overnight. What began as emergency retrofits at Meridian Air is now a global standard, demonstrating that even entrenched industries can embrace rapid change when lives are at stake. Community and compassion. From Wings of Hope, peer groups to the Flight 214 Living Archive, survivors and families found that healing arises from shared stories. The Cable Cutter Scholarship and community memorials showed how personal loss can seed collective hope, inspiring the next generation of engineers, technicians, pilots, and caregivers. Global cooperation. The Geneva Conference exemplified how one tragedy unites disparate nations under a common cause. Trust in aviation is a shared asset. Once compromised, it requires a concerted international effort through policy, technology, training, and empathy to restore. These threads, integrity, innovation, compassion, cooperation, form the fabric of modern aviation safety. They are the legacy of those on Flight 214, woven into every policy enacted, every cockpit sealed, every hand extended in solidarity. Living in the aftermath. In the months that followed, I watched with wonder how the world adapted. Airlines integrated the Flight 214 case study into mandatory safety training for all crew and ground staff, ensuring that every new employee learns not just the mechanics, but the human cost of failure. Flight schools added modules on maintenance ethics and insider threat awareness, cultivating a new generation of pilots attuned to both technical and moral dimensions of their craft. Technology firms expanded research into self-healing materials and blockchain-based maintenance logs, immutable digital records that further tighten security against tampering. Mental health advocates extended programs originally designed for airline technicians to other high-risk industries, rail, maritime, energy, recognizing that the link between psychological well-being and public safety is universal. Yet even as protocols solidified, the heart of the matter remained personal. I received letters from strangers around the globe, parents who now reassured anxious children before takeoff, technicians who found courage to report anomalies, survivors of other disasters who drew strength from Flight 214's example. Each note reaffirmed that our collective vigilance transcends borders and cultures. A vision for the future. Looking forward, our work continues on three fronts: education, expand the Flight 214 Living Archive into a multilingual, interactive platform accessible in airports, museums, and online classrooms. Produce documentary content and virtual reality simulations to immerse trainees in real-world scenarios, reinforcing both technical skills and ethical judgment. Research and innovation. Fund interdisciplinary research teams, combining materials science, cybersecurity, and human factors engineering to develop the next generation of tamper-resistant systems. Pilot autonomous health check drones that autonomously inspect aircraft exteriors and critical control surfaces, providing an extra layer of oversight. Community and support. Grow Wings of Hope. Chapters internationally, connecting survivors and families across continents through annual remembrance events and peer networks. Establish a global coalition of mental health professionals specializing in disaster recovery, offering rapid response counseling in the aftermath of any large-scale incident. These initiatives honor the sacrifices of those we lost and affirm our belief that adversity, when met with courage and collaboration, can yield progress. Flight 214's story belongs not just to aviation, but to anyone who dares to transform tragedy into hope. Closing my journal, I gazed one last time at the framed drawing of Maria guiding passengers through the cabin, beside the photograph of Tanya's fearless smile. I thought of Emma's unwavering presence, of Captain Sinclair's steady hands, of Lily's budding courage, and of every engineer, legislator, and advocate who carried these lessons into action. Our journey through 12 chapters has been more than a recounting of events. It has been a testament to our shared humanity. We have seen darkness in the form of betrayal, fear, and loss, but we have also witnessed light, the flash of sparks that revealed the crime, the selfless heroism that saved lives, and the collective determination that transformed an industry. This is not an ending, but a beginning. As every aircraft prepares for its next flight, so too must we continually reinforce the bonds of trust that hold us aloft. May the memory of Flight 214's 26 souls live on in every policy, every innovation, and every act of compassion that ensures no other flight will ever begin under the same shadow.